My entitled aunt moved into my house without my permission, then stole my car while drunk and crashed it. I had her evicted and arrested, but my grandparents did everything they could to prove her innocence. My aunt showed up at my door one day with all her things in a few rucksacks and told me she'd be staying here for a while. You see, the reason she ended up homeless is because she tried to steal from her previous landlord, and knowing this, I tried to refuse her. But instead of respecting my word, she physically pushed me aside and walked in like she owned the place. I grabbed her hand and told her she wasn't staying here, but she gave me a death stare and said, "Yes, I am, or else." I immediately gulped and let go, and given that she has been to prison for assaulting her boyfriend in his sleep, I put my head down. Just 3 days into living with her, $250 went missing from my wallet. I once again tried to kick her out, but she refused, saying she has rights and isn't leaving. I called my grandparents in an attempt to get some help, but they sided with her, saying I should always help family. I was in disbelief, but I let her stay. Days passed, and things only got worse. My Aunt Diane also had an alcohol problem, and she drank every night. She emptied out bottles of wine that weren't hers to begin with. I wasn't even much of a drinker, but she'd somehow found a stash I'd kept for special occasions. Most mornings, the living room reeked of alcohol, and I'd find her passed out on the couch with crumbs from whatever snack she had raided from my pantry. She never asked if she could eat anything, of course. Diane had this way of assuming she was owed everything of mine just because she was family. Then came the constant complaints. She didn't like the towels I gave her. My pillows weren't fluffy enough. She didn't approve of the soap I used in the bathroom. Everything was wrong, and she never hesitated to let me know. Then she had the nerve to start inviting people over. One night, I came home to find 2 of her old friends, who were also drunk, lounging in my living room like it was some kind of party. Diane was laughing loudly, completely unaware or maybe just indifferent to the fact that I was standing there, fuming. She told me to make myself useful and to buy them some more gin. At that point, I was seriously losing my patience. But every time I thought about kicking her out, I knew my grandparents would be mad at me and give me the "she's family" be compassionate speech again. If she was family and they wanted her to have a place to stay, they should let her stay with them and see if they still felt the same way. Diane was treating me like a doormat. I tried to keep telling myself that maybe things would get better if I just held out a little longer, but I wondered how much longer I would have to wait. I woke up one morning, about 2 weeks after she'd forced herself into my house, and my necklace, my mother's necklace, was gone. It was a delicate gold chain with a small pendant. It was the last thing I had left of my mom. She had given it to me before she passed away, and I loved it more than anything. I tore through my room, looking for it. I thought I had misplaced it, but I knew that wasn't true. I'd kept track of that necklace for years on end. Deep down, I really knew where it was. I walked straight to Diane's room and threw open the door without knocking. She was sprawled out on the bed, looking completely unbothered. I asked her where my necklace was, and she didn't even look up. She acted confused, and I asked her again where my mom's necklace was. It was in my room, and now it was gone. Diane said that she borrowed it for a bit and that she'd give it back to me later. I shouted at her to give it back immediately, but she just laughed again and rolled over, muttering something about how I needed to chill out. I demanded to know where the necklace was that instant, and she said I was selfish in not sharing the necklace with her since her sister had passed away. She said she had every right to that necklace, as I did, but I knew Diane. She didn't want to share the necklace. She sold that necklace to get her next drink. My mind swapped between anger and sadness as I realized that the last thing I had of my mother was gone. That was it for me. I told her to pack her bags and get out of my house, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she sat up, crossed her arms, and smirked. She taunted me, saying she wasn't going anywhere. She said she had the right to stay in my house and that I couldn't just kick her out. I was shaking with rage. I grabbed my phone, called my grandparents, and told them everything about the drinking, the stolen money, the necklace. I thought for sure they'd finally understand, but instead, they said they didn't want to get involved. I hung up the phone. I felt more helpless than ever. I couldn't believe they were basically siding with her again, even after everything she'd done, but there was no use fighting it. I told her that this was the last straw, and that if she didn't leave, then I would call the police on her. Suddenly, something changed in her eyes. She stood up abruptly and walked to the door to leave. Before she did, she knocked over the magazine she had been reading. She started spazzing out. She yelled at me, saying that she did so much for me and I was treating her like trash, and how she was the only one there for me when my mother died, which wasn't true. I began living with my grandparents. She then stormed around the room and began knocking things off the shelves. She knocked everything off the nightstand with one sweeping motion. A picture frame shattered as it hit the floor. I backed out of the room, unsure of what to do. Diane was completely losing it. She was screaming more accusations and blaming me for things that made no sense. She slammed a chair against the wall, leaving a dent, and I felt a panic in my chest. The noise was deafening, and before long, I could hear footsteps outside. The neighbors must have heard the commotion. My heart pounded as I prayed worried someone would call the police because I wasn't sure what to do anymore. I was afraid Diane might actually hurt me. As if on cue, there was a knock at the front door. I rushed to open it, relieved to see 2 police officers standing there. I begged them to take her. She was out of control. They stepped inside, and I led them to Diane's room, where she was still yelling and throwing whatever she could get her hands on. But the moment she saw the police, everything changed. She turned on the waterworks and collapsed onto the bed. She said I was trying to throw her out. She gave them a whole sob story about having to live with me since she was in hard times, and how life hadn't been the same since her sister died. She pleaded for them to let her stay since she had nowhere else to go. I stood there, stunned, watching Diane play the victim. The story sounded so good I almost believed her myself. The officers exchanged glances, clearly unsure of what was really going on. I tried to explain the real situation that she had stolen from me, and she had been terrorizing me for weeks. But Diane's tears and sobs seemed to be more compelling than my story. The officers spoke to her softly, and in the end, they told me that since Diane was a family member and had been staying here for a while, they couldn't forcibly remove her without a formal eviction process. I couldn't believe it. After stealing from me and nearly destroying my home, the police were just leaving. Diane gave me a smug look again as they walked out the door, and I knew she wasn't going anywhere, not until she wanted to. She had won, at least for now. The next few days were hell. Diane became even more unbearable if that was possible. She seemed to sense that I couldn't stand up to her, and she used it to her full advantage. She drank more, trashed the house more, and even started bringing random guys over. I couldn't believe what my home had become. Then, one morning, I woke up and walked outside to drive to work, but my car wasn't in the driveway. I called Diane, but she didn't answer. I reported my car stolen, and after a few hours, the police called me back. Diane had taken my car without asking, gotten drunk, and crashed it into a tree. My car was totaled. It was gone in an instant. I was furious. I didn't even go to the scene. I let the police deal with it. Diane was arrested for DUI and vehicle theft, and for a brief moment, I felt relief. I knew now I could finally get rid of her. But of course, my grandparents called me to bail her out. I don't know what story she gave them, but they made it seem like I was the one responsible and needed to be there for her in her time of need. I told them if they wanted her out of jail so badly, then they could bail her out. She was their kid, not mine. They ended up bailing her out. The next morning, Diane showed up at my door again. She didn't even apologize for what she'd done. Instead, she acted like it was no big deal. She told me not to worry and that she'd pay me back. Meanwhile, I'm using a rental car from my insurance company to get to work. I told her she wasn't welcome in my house anymore and that she needed to find somewhere else to go, but she refused. She planted herself on my front porch and started shouting at me. She made a scene for all my neighbors to see. People started coming outside and watched the commotion. I was humiliated. I couldn't believe this was happening, and once again, I gave in. I let her back inside just to make the chaos stop. No matter what Diane did, no matter how much damage she caused, my grandparents would always take her side. And as long as they did, she'd never leave. She knew it, and I knew it. A few days after Diane's explosive tantrum, I came home from work to find my house practically empty. As I walked through the house, I noticed a few things missing. The small TV I kept in the guest room was gone, along with the expensive headphones I used for work. Diane had pawned almost everything valuable I owned. My electronics, jewelry, and even the kitchen appliances were gone. I stormed into the living room where Diane sat on the couch. I asked her where my stuff went, and she played dumb at first. She then explained the reason she pawned it was because she needed the cash for a few things. She waved me off like I was being ridiculous. She said that she'd pay me back with interest, and there was no reason to worry. I told her to get out of there immediately, and that I was calling the police on her again. Diane rolled her eyes. She had no intention of leaving. I went to grab my phone for the police, and that's when she ran to me and begged for forgiveness. She said that I'd never have to see her again if I let her go this last time, and I prayed she'd keep her word this time. I decided not to call the police and threw her out. Diane then calls our grandparents to tell them her side of the story. They actually threatened to take me out of their will if I didn't help Diane. I told them that she had one more time to pull a stunt like that before I'd send her to jail and throw away the key. I planned to do this the legal way, and if she pulled any funny business, I would evict her immediately. I went to a lawyer and started the eviction process. The moment Diane found out, all hell broke loose. She screamed at me, accusing me of betraying her and turning my back on my family. But I was done listening to her excuses. I ignored the threats and guilt tripping. Soon, she would be gone for good. A couple of nights later, I woke up to the smell of smoke. My heart was racing. I ran to the kitchen and found Diane completely wasted, trying to cook something. The stove was on fire, and the kitchen was filled with thick, black smoke. I managed to put the fire out before it spread, but the damage was done. My kitchen was destroyed. I screamed at Diane, telling her she could have killed us both, but she didn't care. She just shrugged and blamed me for stressing her out. I couldn't believe her audacity. She almost burned my house down, and it was somehow my fault. I called the police again, and this time, I insisted they arrest her. The moment the police slapped the handcuffs on Diane, she completely lost it. Diane was taken away, still screaming about how I was ruining her life, but I didn't care anymore. Part of me couldn't believe it had come to this, but another part of me felt relieved it was finally over. But of course, nothing was ever that simple. The next day, my grandparents stormed into my house. They told me I was tearing the family apart and that I needed to apologize to her. That was the last straw for me. I told them I was done with all of them. I blocked their numbers, cut off contact, and decided to move on with my life without their toxic influence. Diane was sentenced to prison for arson and endangerment, and I immediately got a restraining order against her. I haven't spoken to her or my grandparents since. It was hard, but I knew I had to do it. They were never going to change, and I couldn't keep letting them ruin my life. For the first time in what felt like forever, I was free, and I knew, without a doubt, I'd made the right decision.